What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. This update is being filmed and uploaded Thursday evening, early Friday morning, Beijing time. Let's jump in. Okay guys, first up we need to talk about the Chinese property development sector. I know that we've been discussing this a lot in recent weeks, but there is good reason for that. China Evergrande Group is not the illness, but rather a symptom of a wider systemic issue with the Chinese property sector and with China's growth model generally. The Evergrande crisis is important not because of Evergrande itself, but because it has triggered a wider systemic decision that policymakers in Beijing need to make. As we have discussed in previous episodes, speculative real estate markets in China and aggressive corporate borrowing have driven much of China's growth over the past 2 decades. Real estate and construction now account for 25 to 30% of the economy in the People's Republic of China, twice the levels that we see in developed countries and higher than the US levels in the lead up to the 08-09 financial crisis. Property values are also critical to household wealth, consumer confidence, and government revenues. Nearly 1/3 of local government revenue comes from land sales, and real estate represents 70 to 80% of household wealth. So even a modest slowdown in property sales and development can hit government spending and domestic consumption hard. But in a debt-fueled speculative market, the sector must be brought under control to stabilize financial risk, and that means a painful correction. If successful, China will see lower housing prices and much slower growth, but a healthier and more sustainable growth model going forward. If unsuccessful, that is, if the correction is mismanaged by policymakers, or more likely, if policymakers get cold feet once growth drops and unemployment rises and reverses back to credit-fueled growth, then Beijing will simply be kicking the can down the road, and in a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, it will have an even bigger Evergrande-like crisis on its hands. Now, at this point, there is a correction that needs to be made. I'm hearing from some analysts and even some economists who frankly should know better, that they are arguing that attempts to control the property sector and achieve industry-wide deleveraging is going to damage the Chinese economy over the long term. This is untrue. A dramatic reduction in growth rates is not the same as hurting the economy when the reduction in growth is due to abandoning non-productive investment. If non-productive investment is scaled back, then in fact it is good for the economy over the long term and for the long-term success of the economy, because now debt servicing capacity grows faster than debt growth itself, and capital can flow into more productive areas rather than be wasted on non-productive investment. Now, for those vested interests in the economy that have benefited from years of unbalanced and misallocated investment, any correction and deleveraging is going to hit them very, very hard. But we must not fall into the old fallacy of composition. Just because one part of the economy is doing very poorly does not mean that other parts of the economy or the economy as a whole over the medium to long term doesn't improve. There is one wild card, of course, too, when we talk about all this. The longer it takes to correct an imbalance, the more painful the correction is. And in extreme cases, it can test the political and social institutions of an economy. Just ask the French back in 1789. Beijing has taken a long time to make this correction, and it is by no means clear whether it will be able to see it all the way through this time. It has, after all, tried unsuccessfully in the past to force this correction. Thus, the true legacy of Evergrande will either be that of a turning point in modern Chinese history, where the government transitions China's development to a much slower but much more healthier and sustainable growth model, or it will represent another failed attempt at much needed reform, just like what happened back in 2016 and in 2007 before that. We should know over the next 6 to 12 months which road Beijing has chosen to take. Now, while we're here, we'll have a quick look at Evergrande because there have been a couple of key developments this week. On Wednesday, according to a company bondholder, China Evergrande made interest payments on at least 2 of its bonds with just minutes to spare. Evergrande owed investors interest payments totaling nearly $150 million on 3 bonds. Had Evergrande missed these deadlines, it may well have triggered a wider crisis in the Chinese economy, demanding intervention from regulators. Even with this payment, however, China Evergrande Group is still facing another $366 million in interest payments on its onshore and offshore debt, some already overdue by the end of this year. Evergrande continues to sell its high-quality assets to meet its financial obligations. This week, it confirmed the sale of its roughly 5.7% stake in the technology company Hengteng Networks, raising approximately $145 million. Now, while we're on property and Evergrande, let's move on to another big property developer that we've been following for several weeks now. You guys who watch me normally know that we've been concerned about Kaisa Group Holdings Limited. This is a Shenzhen-based Chinese property developer. Its debt is not as big as Evergrande, but it is still a serious player that looks to be in a lot of trouble. The Chinese developer attended a meeting on Monday with the Development Research Center of the State Council. The State Council acts as a type of executive or council or a cabinet for the Chinese government based in Beijing. The center, however, is a policy shop. It's a think tank. It is not a decision-making body. Now, it has been leaked to Chinese media that at this meeting, Kaisa Group urged state companies to help struggling private-run developers like itself by buying their assets at asking prices rather than market prices, essentially a form of state bailout. Like I said, we've been following Kaisa for at least a month now, so we should not be shocked that they're facing a particularly dire situation and having trouble meeting their obligations. Kaisa also announced yesterday that it will be selling its own high-quality assets, including its Shenzhen-based headquarters, in order to meet its financial obligations due to missed payments. Now for a quick Delta outbreak update. Just like last time, the situation is still serious, with the outbreak not completely out of control, but still not under control. According to the Beijing-based National Health Commission, on Monday, 43 new locally transmitted COVID cases were discovered. On Tuesday, this number was 54. On Wednesday, 47. Now remember, these are official government numbers, so take all of this with a grain of salt. What is frustrating officials is that cases are popping up all over the place, over dozens of cities across several provinces, rather than just in one place. Schools in Dalian, for example, were suspended on Tuesday to prevent cluster infections, and the city has required people to provide a COVID test within 24 hours if they want to leave the city. The city has seen dozens of cases over the last few days. Now, on the other side of the country, in southwest China's Sichuan province, a super spreader event was discovered when one woman spread COVID to 13 in her building. Then in Shanghai on the east coast, the Shanghai Marathon was postponed this week due to concerns with the outbreak. And then jumping up to the northeast, the spread of COVID in the key Chinese city bordering North Korea has halted rail freight between the two countries only 8 days after they had lifted the almost 2 years long ban on rail freight. And while we're on the outbreak, the domestic debate surrounding China's zero cases, also known as zero tolerance policy, heats up this week. We remember in the last episode a few days ago, we discussed the interview with Guan Li, a prominent Chinese virologist who called the zero cases policy, quote, impossible to achieve, end quote. While this interview has caused a bit of a stir on the mainland, it appears that the official line domestically is still that zero tolerance or zero case policy is here to stay until well into next year. For example, in a speech at the China International Import Expo, the former chief epidemiologist of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, China CDC, expressed that China would need to continue its zero tolerance strategy against COVID-19 with nationwide emergency responses, including, quote, maintaining long quarantines and vigorous contact tracing until a barrier of immunity has been established, end quote. Details of this barrier of immunity were not given during the speech. Also on Wednesday, the state-run Global Times quoted an anonymous, quote, senior public health expert close to the National Health Commission, end quote, who expressed, quote, we can't abandon the zero tolerance policy now, as given the global pandemic situation, changing our epidemic prevention policies and lifting strict controls would cause a catastrophic outcome, end quote. So like I said, we're seeing still a very strong mainstream view within the elite circles, but probably also amongst regular Chinese circles, that the policy should be maintained. But like I said, the debate does continue into this week. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a huge help for a small YouTuber like myself. My clients have to pay for this stuff, but I give it to you guys for free. So if you can just hit that like button, it makes a huge difference for the algorithm. If you're watching this for the first time and you think you're getting some value from the episode, maybe consider subscribing. I release 2 or 3 of these every week. So if you want the most up-to-date analysis on China, if you hit that bell notification, you'll get these as soon as they're released. And as always, I want to take this opportunity to thank my Patreon supporters. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for supporting a small channel like this. I really appreciate it. On Wednesday, the Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reported that due to closely monitored vaccination rates, fake over-reported populations are being exposed all across the country. It has been a long-standing assumption that some local governments tend to over-report their populations in censuses because certain government subsidies are allocated based on the number of local people in these places. Closely monitored vaccination rates now show that this is indeed the case in some regions across the country. This has serious implications for China's demographic health going forward, which, according to official numbers, was already deeply concerning for policymakers. And last up, let's talk about Taiwan. In recent weeks, European lawmakers and Taipei officials have repeatedly engaged with each other, suggesting European officials and lawmakers are increasingly willing to risk angering Beijing to engage with Taipei. Last week, after backing a resolution calling for stronger ties with the island, the European Parliament sent its first ever formal delegation to Taiwan. It has also been reported that 6 lawmakers, including 2 senators from the US, have made surprise trips to Taiwan recently. The following day, a PRC defense spokesperson unsurprisingly condemned the visit. On Tuesday, the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command conducted a joint combat readiness patrol near the Taiwan Straits, and Monday of this week, Taiwan began its own, quote, combat readiness week, end quote, operations. A foreign policy review of Pentagon data provided by the Defense Manpower Data Center found that US Marines stationed in Taiwan saw a small surge in their numbers from earlier this year. Officially, the US has kept small contingents of troops on the island since at least September 2008. Okay guys, that's this episode of China Update. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you guys. And as always, I hope you're keeping safe and keeping sane. I will see you guys next time on China Update.